Welcome to Pivot Point Church for today's message. Today, we will be studying Jacob leaving Laban to return to Canaan. It's found in Genesis 31. Please make sure that you download the worksheet for today, and it can be found on our website at www.pivotpointchurch or on our brand new free app, which you can download from Google or Apple. Please like and share our videos so others can find us. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our messages. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for coming together with us, showing us who you are through your stories that you give us. Open our hearts and our minds and ears to be receptive to your words so that we might get to know you even better. Amen. We're going to start today Genesis chapter 31, start right at the beginning. Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, "Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father." And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." Well, so Jacob's wealth made Laban's sons jealous. These sons were probably born after Jacob arrived in Haran. Concerned about their welfare, the sons accused Jacob of being a thief. Jacob's wealth was making Laban's sons jealous. Sometimes it's difficult to be happy when others are doing better than we are. Comparing our successes with those of others is a dangerous way to judge the quality of our own life. By comparing ourselves to others, we may be giving jealousy a foothold, giving Satan an opportunity to get in on our lives. But we can avoid it by rejoicing in other people's successes. It's a little hard to do, but it can be done. Jacob left for Canaan, though he's getting ready to leave, for two very interrelated reasons. There's an animosity by Laban's sons, and it keeps growing against Jacob. And of course, that makes Laban's mood is also dangerous. Now, I know that sometimes God stirs up the nest a little bit. When we get complacent and we get used to being in a situation, and it's far more uncomfortable to leave than it is to stay, sometimes it takes God to let in there and stir things up a little bit and make it a little harder for us. And I think that may be the case here. Jacob is finally seeing that it's probably time. But the second reason is that God told Jacob it was time to return to his own land. It is a divine call to leave for the land of promise that God has repeated his promises that he gave to Jacob at Bethel. And he promised that he would be with Jacob as he returned to his homeland. The time had come for him to take over the patriarchal responsibility associated with God's promises. He possessed both the birthright and the blessing, and they entailed great responsibilities as well as privileges, which it was now time to fulfill. Verse 4. So Jacob sent word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where his flocks were. He said to them, "I see that your father's attitude towards me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I've worked for your father with all my strength, and yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said, the speckled ones will be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said, the streaked ones will be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given it to me. Speckled, streaked, spotted. Apparently, Laban kept on switching the deal as he watched the births of a variety of colored animals rather than the solid colored ones. But with every new deal, God always increased Jacob's herd. Although Laban treated Jacob unfairly, God still increased Jacob's prosperity. God's power is not limited by a lack of fair play. He has the ability to meet our needs and make us thrive even though others might mistreat us. To give in and respond unfairly is to be no different from your enemies. Verse 10, in breeding season, I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw that the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled, or spotted. The angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I answered, here I am. And he said, look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land. So God is revealing himself in Jacob's dream. In the past, Jacob had achieved what he wanted through deceit and trickery. But now he has achieved great wealth because of God's blessings. So the women are going to respond because they've been brought out to the field where he's working so that he can share with them his plans. Now watch how they're going to explain and agree with him, because Laban had exploited his daughter's wealth and had lost their goodwill. So because of Laban, their father's behavior, they're willing to leave. Now, the Lord had identified himself as the same God who had introduced himself when Jacob was on his way to Haran at Bethel. So he knows that this is the same God who's been from the beginning to where he is, to where he's been and where he's going. He recognizes the same God. So verse 14, then Rachel and Leah replied, do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us. Surely all the wealth God took away from our father belongs to us and our children. So do whatever God has told you. These women are absolutely supporting their husband. It's pretty amazing that they are in agreement in this, and they're like, no, not doing it. Dad sold us. They both resented the way their father had sold them. And they believed that whatever God had taken away from their father really belonged to them anyway. Leaving home was not difficult for Rachel and Leah because their father had treated them as poorly as he had Jacob. According to the custom, they were supposed to receive the benefits of the dowry that Jacob had paid for them, which was 14 years of hard work. When Laban did not give them what was rightfully theirs, they knew they would never inherit anything from their father. And thus, they wholeheartedly approved of Jacob's plan to take the wealth they had gained and leave. Verse 17, then Jacob put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove all his livestock ahead of him, along with all the goods he had accumulated in Padan Aram, and go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. When Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Moreover, Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean by not telling him he was running away. So he fled with all he had. He crossed the Euphrates River and headed for the hill country of Gilgal. This shows the pagan influence in Laban's family. Perhaps she told herself that she deserved them since Laban had turned the tables on her. in the name of custom and deprived her of the right to marry first. But her hard hearted self interest almost brought disaster in this culture because the possession of the household idols was the right of the principal heir. Rachel probably didn't steal the idols in order to worship them, but in order to retain the rights of the principal heir for Jacob. Many people kept small wooden or metal idols or gods in their homes. These idols are called teraphim. They were thought to protect the home and offer advice in times of need. But more importantly, they had legal significance because they were passed on to the heir. The person who received them could rightfully claim the greatest part of the family inheritance. No wonder Laban was concerned when he realized his idols were missing. Verse 22. On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. Taking his relatives with him, he pursued Jacob for 7 days and caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. Then God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." Well, from time to time, God will warn others not to harm his people. He will make himself known to those who don't even believe in him. And in Laban's dream, God spoke to him, giving him a sober warning against doing injury to Jacob in any way. He was not even to speak to him if the intent of the conversation was going to be influence him or return or to reproach him for leaving. God made it plain that Jacob was under his protection and was following his directions. Though Laban did not know the Lord in a personal way, he did know enough about him to know that he'd better do what he said. Verse 25. Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead when Laban overtook him, and Laban and his relatives camped there too. Then Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done? You deceived me, and you've carried off my daughters like captives of war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why did you tell me so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You have done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you, but last night the God of your father said to me, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.' Now you have gone off because you long to return to your father's household. But why did you steal my gods?" The sudden departure, Laban charges, was similar to a raiding party that took captives. Laban immediately blurted out a hypocritical speed of feigned concern over Jacob's secret snatching away of his daughters and grandchildren, without giving him an opportunity to even kiss them goodbye. He complained that he would have sent them joyously with great festivities of music and laughter had Jacob not slipped away unannounced. Jacob, as well as Leah and Rachel, and no doubt the whole company, all knew that Laban was lying. But Laban was afraid to say what was really on his mind in view of God's warning. Only God's warning stilled Laban's rage. He says, "The God of your father," not the God that he recognized, not his God, but he did recognize that it was Jacob's God who talked to him. Verse 31. Jacob answered Laban, "I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. But if you find anyone who has your gods, that person shall not live. In the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whether there is anything of yours here with me, and if so, take it." Now, Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the gods. Well, Jacob is trying to explain himself. He says that he left in secret because he was genuinely afraid that he wouldn't be permitted to leave with his family. Furthermore, he declared that his whole household was innocent of that alleged theft and cursed the thief of idols with death. A rather rash decision, don't you think? Do you remember ever feeling absolutely sure about something? Jacob was so sure that no one had stolen Laban's idols that he vowed to kill the offender. But because Rachel took them, this statement put her safety in serious jeopardy. Even when you are absolutely sure about a matter, it is so much safer to avoid rash statements because someone may hold you to them. Verse 33. So Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the two female servants. But he found nothing. After he came out of Leah's tent, he entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them inside her camel's saddle and was sitting on them. Laban searched through everything in the tent but found nothing. Rachel said to her father, "Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period." So he searched, but he could not find the household gods. Laban was certain that Jacob had stolen the idols, and so he began his search in Jacob's tent. Lastly, he entered Rachel's tent. The fact that each wife had her own tent does have a small indication of the wealth of Jacob. So, if not the gods, Laban was hoping maybe that he might be able to find something else that Jacob had stolen, thus giving him a reason to complain to God that his protection of Jacob was unjustified, perhaps to justify himself in taking back all his flocks, which he no doubt still desired to do. Rachel was hiding the idols in her saddlebags and sat on them while she made her excuses. Laban did not ask her to move because there was a male taboo that respected a woman who was experiencing her monthly period. What do you think Jacob would have done if Laban had discovered the images in Rachel's tent? Would he have actually handed her over for execution as he offered? And would Laban have actually carried it out and killed his own daughter? Rachel, by what she probably thought at the time was just a little sin, had indeed placed her husband, and her father in a most difficult situation. She was no doubt fearful for her own life as well as that of Jacob. She thought it was probably better to just feign ignorance rather than to point out that she had taken him. She didn't want to confess what she had done and ask forgiveness. She probably made a wise choice in that one, considering her father's choices. Her best alternative was exactly the strategy she used, and God even allowed it to succeed, knowing that Jacob was innocent of the matter and its discovery would have fallen hardest on Jacob. Laban would have charged him with theft and lying, even though Laban knew that Jacob would never have taken the images. So, verse 36, Jacob was angry and took Laban to task. "What is my crime?" he asked Laban. "How have I wronged you that you hunt me down? Now that you've searched through all my goods, what have you found that belongs to your household? Put it here in front of your relatives and mine, and let them judge between the two of us." Jacob, in his anger, recited the woes of working for Laban. To trespass means to overstep a boundary, or to sin is to miss a target, like an archer might when they miss the target. Unsuspecting Jacob lost his temper at this point, and he burst forth in a heated protest at Laban's attitudes and his actions, which he had suffered in silence for so many years. All that pent-up emotion, which he had restrained for so long, he just poured it out against Laban. But Jacob had some leverage. Laban had been humiliated before his own men, and his resolve to stop Jacob necessarily had to weaken. He couldn't keep pursuing him because he had no grounds at this point, because he couldn't prove that Jacob had taken anything that didn't belong to him. Verse 38, I have been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore that loss myself. And you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime, and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for the 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you. We must remember that Jacob had served 14 years for his 2 wives, and then he worked another 6 in order to gain the flocks. Jacob never charged Laban for any loss, so that he could never charge Jacob for mismanagement. Furthermore, Jacob described the seasonal extremities that he suffered. Laban changed the terms of their agreement 10 times, trying to cheat Jacob. Please look at verse 42, where it says, the fear of Isaac. This name for God means that Isaac feared God with a reverential awe, not I'm afraid of, I'm going to get killed kind of fear. It's the awe fear. It's the fear that we see, the fear of God. It wasn't because he was afraid. It was because he was just so incredibly awesome. Jacob made it his habit, though, to do more than was expected of him. He could have easily shirked his duties. He could have easily taken the shortcut. He could have easily done it differently. But he worked extra hard to keep everything above board. When his flocks were attacked, he took the losses rather than splitting them with Laban. He worked hard even after several pay cuts. I know I would have a hard time with that. His diligence eventually paid off because his flocks multiplied. Making a habit of doing more than expected can really pay off. Because number 1, it pleases God. Number 2, it can earn recognition and advancement. It enhances your reputation. Others have better confidence in you. It gives you more experience and knowledge because you've worked extra hard. And most importantly, it develops your spiritual maturity. Verse 43, Laban answered Jacob, the women are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine. Yet what can I do today about these daughters are mine, or about the children they have borne? Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as a witness between us. Well, we have to remember, in this day and age, Laban would have been the patriarch of this area, and he considered Jacob's children part of his extended family, which he was his grandfather. He also believed that everything that Jacob had still belonged to him. Laban didn't have a leg to stand on, though, with his accusations, and did not deny any of Jacob's claims or charges. Instead, Laban changed the subject, trying to shift the focus off his own culpability to whatever he could grasp, his daughters, his grandchildren, anything he could get a hold of. Laban is suggesting, though, that they make a covenant as a boundary between them. Laban is the one that instigated it, for Jacob neither needed it or cared about it. And Jacob's the one that set up the tall stone and then piled a heap of stones around it. The covenant in this situation refers to a parity covenant, or an agreement between equals. We'll see the word mitzvah, which means watchtower. So saying that God is going to watch. This is a covenant of peace in God's name. Verse 45. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. And he said to his relatives, gather some stones. So they took stones and piled them in a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Jagar Sahuditha, and Jacob called it Galeed. 48. Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me today." That is why it was called Galeed. It was also called Mitzpah, because he said, "May the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are away from each other. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take any wives besides my daughters, even though no one is with us, remember, God is a witness between you and me." We have to remember, though, that the stolen idols, these teraphim, could be used to show property ownership. It could be used by his son-in-law as proof of being the principal heir, rather than the sons that are the younger brothers of his wives. And this is why Laban is insisting on a boundary stone at Mitzpah. It's to assure the property that he has will go to his sons. Jacob, for a second time, is setting up a stone as a memorial. The first time on his way down to Haran, or up to Haran, and the second time coming back to Canaan. On the way to Haran at Bethel, he set up the pillar to mark the place where God had spoken to him on the way there. It is the place of their agreement, meant as a witness heap in both their languages. Laban is calling it Jagar Sahuditha, it's in Aramaic, while Jacob called it Galeed, which is in Hebrew. Mitzpah means outlook point, beacon, or watchtower. It is related to the Hebrew word means to watch, meaning God above had his eyes on both men to make them keep their covenant. In order to be binding, though, the agreement had to be witnessed by a third party. In this case, Jacob and Laban are using God as their witness that they would keep their word. Verse 51. Laban also said to Jacob, "Here is this heap, and here is this pillar I have set up between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness, that I will not go past this heap to your side to harm you, and that you will not go past this heap and pillar to my side to harm me. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor and the God of their father judge between us." Laban took the initiative in proposing the terms of their covenant after the pillar was erected. He took credit for putting the pillar and the heap up, even though Jacob and probably the relatives he talked about were his sons. And it is implying by this that Jacob was the one that could be trusted. And he's demanding certain restriction on Jacob's activities. He said that Jacob could not come back to Haran bent on revenge against Laban, even though he was well aware of Jacob's character, and he knew that he would never think of such a thing. Laban relished the idea of smearing the reputation of Jacob through this implied threat. The heap and pillar were a double witness between the two men, because neither was to cross the symbols in order to harm the other. Although this covenant ceremony has significance for Jacob and Laban, it's going to have an even greater significance for their descendants, because the hill country of Gilead marks the approximate boundary between ancient Israel and the neighboring nation of Aram, which is modern-day Syria and part of Jordan. Jacob and Laban's promise not to transgress this boundary marker is intended to be honored by future generations as well. The oath that Laban speaks suggests that Abraham, Nahor, and their father Terah all worship the same God. Laban concluded his wordy proposal by invoking the name of God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of their father. The word used here is Elohim. Elohim is a plural noun, which can be used to mean gods, multiple. We use it, or we see it used in the Bible, to refer to God the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Laban is evoking the name of Elohim, all three Trinity, but probably meaning it to encompass all the gods, the pagan gods as well as God. The god of Nahor is most likely that idol that he was worried about. The term God of their father referred to both gods, or perhaps it was an attempt to try to identify Laban's God with the one true God of Abraham. Jacob didn't try to clear up Laban's theological confusion and simply made his own oath in the name of God, who had been the fear of his father Isaac. So Jacob took an oath in the name of the fear of his father Isaac. He offered a sacrifice there in the hill country and invited his relatives to a meal. After they had eaten, they spent the night there. Early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he left and returned home. Jacob is offering a sacrifice. He's worshiping. It is the only time where Jacob is engaging in the sacrificial worship. Laban came back the next morning after this party to say goodbye to his daughters and his grandchildren, but he could not bring himself to apologize to Jacob or to give him any words of blessing. But at least he did want to leave his daughters and grandsons with a note of affection. No further mention is made in the Bible of Laban or his sons. And Laban is an unfortunate example of a worldly, covetous man, one who knows about the true God, but doesn't have a relationship with him, and to whom a thorough witness has been given, and yet he doesn't know him. He has seen the reality of God in the life of Jacob, along with the power of God in those blessings and the protection. And he himself has even enjoyed many of the blessings of God through his relationship to Jacob. Nevertheless, he continued in his idolatry and his covetousness, seeking material gain for himself to the exclusion of all other considerations. His life constitutes a sober warning to those semi-religious, but fundamentally self-worshiping, self-seeking men and women today. Always do your best and God will reward it. Now it's time for us to grab that worksheet. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a few notes as we were reading through this, but we're going to go through all of those squares: the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how. It's really important that we dig a little bit. We won't get the full picture unless we do the digging. God reveals himself in his word, but we got to look a little bit. You got to look underneath the surface. Stories are great, but let's go and see who God is. So we're in the who. Who is this story about? Well, pretty simple. We've got Jacob and Laban. Who else is in this story? Well, the wives and the children and the servants of both Jacob and Laban, the relatives of Laban, as well as God, of course, is in this story as well. We have to realize that a lot of times these things happen and we focus only on the main character. That's why we go dig and see who else is in here. Who else is going to be affected by the things that happen in this story? The other who that we want to look at is who is the ruler of the area at the time that this was written. The patriarchs, the tribal groups. So you had a group of people, family usually, and you had a father, grandfather, great-grandfather who's kind of looking out over that whole grouping. That was the patriarchs, the father, over tribes. Now, as we get a little further into this, this will be more important because we want to be able to see who the ruler of the area is and be able to place it in the timeline with what else is going on elsewhere in the world. The next box is what. what is the moral of the story? Why, or what is it that we should learn from this story? I think we should remember that God is watching over his people, that even when bad things are happening, that God is still right there. And no matter what, God's plan is going to happen and he will take care of his people. Jacob is planning to go home to his own family with his family, with his wives, with his children, with his flock. But we need to know there's always trouble. So the trouble I saw is that Jacob left without saying goodbye. Now, he was justified to load it all up and head out, but he didn't do it in a way that was conducive to maintaining a good relationship. Oftentimes, we know that people will just get up and leave. They never say goodbye or give a reason for leaving. This happens particularly common in a church setting where somebody gets upset and they leave the church and never come back. And you may not understand what's going on or why they left, and they never said goodbye. And I think, many of us have also been guilty of that. And so it's tough when that happens to try to figure out why they left. We've all experienced this. We know how that can leave a little bit of hurt in our relationship. With our trust maybe was a little bit damaged because of that. Where's the next one? Where is this story taking place? It's taking place in Mizpah or Mount Gilead. It's actually a mountainous region that's east of the Jordan River. The northern edges are nearly 300 miles from Haran. So we're talking that this is going to take them quite a while. At 10 or 15 miles a day, it's going to take them a while to get there. The next question is when? Now, after a little more research, discovered that this is taking place about 1920 BCE. BCE is before the Common Era. Then so we're talking about 1900 years before Christ. And so this time it's still kind of middle Bronze Age era, early Stone Age. And so you do have very little history at that point. We have a little bit going on, but that gives you an idea of when this was taking place. Why do you think this story was important? Or why should we even care about this story? I think it's important that we understand Jacob's family, his return to the promised land, and it is a history of Jesus's family, because ultimately Jesus will be a descendant of this particular family. And so we need to understand where all of these people came from and how they got where they're going and what God was doing in this family from the very moment that Abraham was chosen. It helps us to understand God's chosen people and that God is still going to work with fallen people. I think it also is going to give us hope. So remember that trouble where he left without saying goodbye? How is this trouble resolved in our story? Well, eventually Laban catches up with the caravan, but he can do no harm because the warning he received from God. And therefore Jacob and Laban make a pact. They make that covenant, that agreement that neither will go past this boundary marker in order to hurt the other. I think Jacob was just as relieved to have that boundary in place as Laban was. Laban was worried that Jacob would come back and show those idols and take possession, as these are Laban's. I have ownership, therefore they're mine. Jacob, knowing that that pillar was in place with witnesses, would keep Laban from coming and trying to take the flocks or the children or grandchildren. We need to understand, though, too, that sometimes people leave without saying goodbye, but others will pursue us with intent to harm us, but God's always going to protect his people. If someone has left and not said goodbye, have you gone chasing after them to find out? Have you attempted to reach out to communicate with them and find out why? Or if there was some miscommunication or some misunderstanding that you could correct? Laban came with the intent of harm and ended up creating a covenant with Jacob instead. Maybe there's a place where you can create a forgiveness, a healing of a hurt that nobody but the person that was hurt knows about because they left without saying goodbye. The other thing we need to think about, how long was this journey going to take this caravan? So they were 3 days, their flocks were 3 days outside of where Jacob was keeping his sheep, and they were in the middle of shearing, so they were shearing their sheep. So 3 more days before they even figured out Jacob had left. So Jacob had a 1 week head start, and it took them less than a week to catch up. Jacob kept moving during the week that Laban was chasing him. So he's been gone for 2 weeks before Laban catches up with him, because a day's journey was about 30 miles or so for men that were traveling unencumbered. However, if you're moving the flocks and you're moving the herds and you're moving with small children and such, they might make it only 15 to 20 miles a day, depending. Pretty tough going when you have a large group of herds and sheep that were going. The next 3 boxes we're going to look at, are there any repetitions? We're looking for words that are repeated, like verily, verily, or truly, truly, or where he says the sentence twice, or he says it several times throughout. I didn't notice any specific that I would notice as repetitions. The next box is asking, are there any comparisons made? This is if so-and-so's like, and I didn't notice any of those as well. However, the next one, are there any if-then statements? Go back and look at verse 32, where Jacob is making his rash decision. If you find anyone who has your gods, that person shall not live. Now, granted, there's only an if that rather than if then, but if you find, then that person shall not live. The other one I found was in verse 42. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, then, implied, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you. Well, as always, I will try to help us recognize that the Old Testament and the New Testament are really one in the same book. It's one continuous story. And so oftentimes we will find a nugget hidden in the New Testament that refers back to the Old Testament. We're going to find that today in Matthew 6, verse 4. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Now, why did I pick that one? Because Jacob kept doing what was right in spite of the hardships, in spite of his being cheated, in spite of his father-in-law trying to cheat him out of stuff. God the Father was seeing what was going on and was taking care of him. And God is going to take care of you as well. You keep doing what's right. You keep following his example, and God will take care of you. Next week, we're going to talk about Jacob returning all the way to Canaan, meeting his brother, and we're going to do that. That's in Genesis 32 and 33. Thanks for watching. Please make sure you help us out by liking and sharing our videos and our posts. It really does help us reach more people. Join us Sunday for our next teaching, and then Zoom with us at 1 o'clock on Sunday. We can answer any questions either study has brought up. If you find this ministry is a benefit to you, please consider supporting us. You can donate by check or money order by mailing it to P.O. Box 806, Brighton, Colorado 80601. Or you can use the Give tab on our website or on our new app. All donations are tax deductible. As always, find a way this week to be a blessing to someone else. See you next time.